Welcome back to another episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast. Joining me on the podcast again is Jeff Kryglik. Jeff and I are going to be discussing strongman training and how to train for various events and lifts and that sort of thing without access to the specific apparatus that you might need. So a lot of times, some of the events require very specific tools or apparatuses, for lack of a better way to put it. And some of them can be a little bit expensive. There might not be one at your gym, or someone you know might not have one, and that sort of thing. So we talked about alternatives. While this is a great episode for training purposes, I also think that this is a great episode for individuals such as myself in the PT setting, because oftentimes we get an athlete, like a strongman athlete, that needs to rehab, but we might not have access to the specific equipment that they need, but we can certainly come up with great alternatives with strong carryover. So I think this is a great listen for everyone that way. This episode and all of our episodes in season 5 are sponsored by Isophit, my go-to for all things isometric training. For more on them, you can check out the description below. Enjoy. Jeff, welcome back to the podcast, man. Super excited to work with you again today. Thanks for being here.
Happy to be here, Dan. Looking forward to talking some strongman and some workarounds if you don't have the strongman implements themselves.
Definitely. I think this is going to be a real essential episode, and it's definitely going to help a lot of people who want to get into strongman. And, we talked about that at length before with you, Brian, and Greg. But for people who maybe didn't catch that episode or they're not familiar with who you are, would you mind filling them in a little bit about all the great stuff you're doing?
Well, thanks, Dan. First of all, my name is Jeff Kryglik. I'm a personal trainer and strength coach. I'm based out of Baltimore, Maryland, and I've been competing in strongman since late 2015. I've done about 25 different competitions, ranging from the national all the way up to the world level. I did the official strongman games in the 90 kilogram or 200-pound, roughly 200-pound weight class in 2018, competed at nationals 3 times. And I'm still doing it today. And I'm a little bit more broken, a little bit more beat up, but it's still a lot of fun. And I've never been bored with this style of training.
Yeah, definitely. And I think for those that aren't familiar, I feel like strongman is very hard to define to one event because there's so many different things that you do. But for lack of a better way to put it, it is just great feats of strength and full body demand, for lack of a better way to put it.
The thing that I love about strongman is I have an athletic background. I played baseball and football, a little bit of soccer growing up, but mostly baseball and football. And especially with football, I saw a tremendous amount of carryover in terms of athleticism required. Now, don't get me wrong, if you've ever seen strongman, you've probably seen people lifting Atlas stones, cars, logs, all these crazy wild implements that weigh a heck of a lot of weight. But it's not always about that. When I think of strongman, I think of it truly as a strength sport. And the word sport isn't used loosely because you have to be athletic. You have to have good cardiovascular endurance. You have to have good muscular endurance because when you're doing strongman, you're going to be tested on a variety of different disciplines. So typically when it comes to a strongman competition, you're going to have anywhere between 4 to 6 events. Now, those events can come in varying degrees of difficulty. They can come in various shapes and sizes. That's up to the promoter themselves. And it's also up to you if you want to sign up and do the competition. So usually the typical disciplines that are tested is some form of a deadlift. That could be with anything ranging from a barbell to an axle or a thick bar. That could even be a side handle deadlift. Sometimes I've been seeing trap bar actually making its way into strongman. It was actually tested at nationals this past year, which I quite frankly was surprised. But hey, if you get a Kabuki sponsor, go for it. Then you have the best lift, in my opinion, which is car deadlift, which Dan has now had the pleasure of lifting my Toyota Camry. So hats off to Dan for accomplishing that amazing feat of strength. But then there's also even stranger implements like a lever deadlift. Greg and I actually had the pleasure of testing that out at USS Nationals. Greg was able to get all 5, but basically the way that works is you have weight behind you, you are in front of the implement itself, and you have to take your handle and attach it to the implement, lift it, and then move back closer to where the center of gravity is. So it obviously gets heavier as you get closer to where the weight is. So that's one discipline that you'll typically see. If a competition doesn't have a deadlift, it more than likely will have some form of a squat event, which could be anything from a standard barbell, which isn't really that common, More common in strongman is with an axle or a thick bar on your back. You could also have a barbell that may have big apparatuses on the end, like a wagon wheel, where you have to go down to depth and touch a box. They'll tell you it's good, and then you come back up. Some competitions allow you to just tap in and come back up. And I've actually had the pleasure of squatting a car. So you can literally do anything when it comes to strongman. So again, if you don't see a deadlift, typically you'll probably see some form of a squatting event. And if you don't have either one of those, I don't know what to tell you. Pick better competition, just my opinion. So then the next discipline that you'll typically always see is some form of an overhead press. This can also come in a wide variety of implements. So log is probably the most commonly associated with strongman. This could be with a wooden log or a metal log that was created by a fabricator or a company. You'll also see an axle or a thick bar. This is something where the beauty of strongman is there's not a whole lot of rules. So you can press it up, you can clean it up however you want. If you want to limp it, clean it, by God, you can try that. I'm not going to say it's going to be perfect, but some people who have that background, it works well for them. You can split jerk, you can strict press, you can try to do it all in one motion, you can push press, push jerk, everything you name it, you can find a way to get it up. But then along with, the standard typical barbell type of lifts that you might see, you could see a circus dumbbell, which is a big giant dumbbell, not like the dumbbells that you see in the gym, an enlarged dumbbell with a much thicker handle that you have to try and balance and then find your center of gravity and press it overhead. You can also encounter a block press, which is a big, usually like rectangle square looking thing where you can fill with either plates, lead shot, you name it. And then you have to clean that up to your chest, which usually looks very spinal looking if you've ever seen the Mike Tyson meme. And then you have to press it over your head. And typically with something like that, you're not going to be able to be as reliant on leg drive because the implement itself is going to be a lot further out in front of you. So the second that you dip your legs, if you don't have perfect leg drive where you're pushing your knees out and your hips are underneath you, that thing's going to fall forward. Then on top of that, you could also press a keg. I've even seen some stone pressing, which is really, really risky. And I've done it myself and actually had a stone land on my face. Do not recommend, but I did come back and do it again and I did press it. So that's all that matters. So that's the pressing discipline. That could be a little bit of everything again, kind of like the deadlift. But again, it's ultimately up to you which competition that you're going to do. So then on top of that, you're going to have a carrying discipline. So this is something a little bit more traditional, like your farmer's walks, which, some people can do with regular dumbbells in the gym. But typically at a competition, there will be handles that will be crafted either by a fabricator or purchased from like an equipment company. They can either be top loaded, which is where the weights are pointing or the pins are pointing to the sky and you load the weights on top. Or you could have them front loaded where the pins are pointing out and you load the weights on that way. So that's an example of a carrying event. Some of the other ones include a keg carry. That one's going to be out in front of you. You're going to be holding that against your chest. And sometimes these events will be either for max distance or they could be for a short sprint. Sometimes it's with a turn. There's a variety of ways that you can do these events. Other implements that you may carry: a stone, a sandbag. I've even seen a fire engine carry. That's a little bit more old school strongman. And every so often or not a fire engine, a fire hydrant carry, excuse me there. I've seen that in strongman and even an oil barrel carry. That's far less common, but because it's such a cumbersome object, it is really cool to watch those events. So then in addition to a carrying event, you're going to have some sort of loading discipline. So this is where you'll see things like Atlas stones put up onto a platform or put over a bar. This can also be done with sandbags. This could be done with kegs, and this could be done with a variety of different odd objects. And then typically strongman competitions will have either a fifth or a sixth event, and they're kind of wild cards. So depending on the promoter, some promoters like to do things a little bit more extravagant. So something that'll look good on your Instagram or Facebook profile, like a truck pull, for example. This could be done with yourself strapped into a harness and the truck behind you. You're pulling a rope to try and bring that truck to the finish line. Or you could be seated on some sort of implement or even inside a tire, and you're pulling the truck in front of you with a rope. In addition to that, there are also the ever so popular Denny stone carry nowadays, which kind of replicates, there are actually handles now that replicate the Denny stones, which is a test of strength overseas. But now they actually have loading pins where with replica rings where you can carry those with either hook grip or just your bare hands if you want to, carry them from start to finish. That gets a little bit more wobbly. That can be fall under the carry event category, but sometimes it's a little bit more of a wild card. Then also you have other events like a sandbag throw. Now, I'm not talking about a big cumbersome sandbag that may weigh anywhere between 100 pounds up to 400 pounds. This is something that's going to range anywhere as little as I've seen 15 all the way up to like 85. And that's the 85 is like the ultimate elite level. But usually what'll happen with that is somebody will set up a bar or some sort of apparatus, and it'll be like anywhere between 12 to 15, maybe even 16 feet in the air, and you have to throw it over that apparatus. Now this could be done in a series. Sometimes I've seen a max weight variation of this. So like let's say you start out at 15 pounds and you keep throwing it over the bar. So you'll make one successful throw, then move up to 20, then move up to 25, et cetera, et cetera. Other competitions will raise the bar height. So if you've ever seen Hafthor Julius Bjornsson from Game of Thrones throw anything, it is a friggin' masterpiece. He's gotten, I think, the throwing record now for he throws kegs. So you can also throw like the pony kegs. He throws kegs as high as like 24 feet. So these events can be really entertaining to watch. Every so often you'll get some other random events like old school strongman absolutely loved like sumo wrestling, where it's like legitimate sumo wrestling. You'll see a big circle, you'll see the guys go mano a mano and they'll try to push each other out. One that I've seen that's a little common that I personally don't like because I think the injury risk is really high is pole push. So essentially what that is you'll have a long wooden beam. There will be handles on the end. It'll be two competitors in a circle, and you'll have to try and push the other competitor out of the circle using your leverage against theirs and just moving that beam the entire time. And then if you there's another event on top of that that's kind of similar and sometimes used as a tiebreaker, which is a tug of war. So that's traditional tug of war. You'll put the rope on the ground and it's mano a mano. You pull. If you can pull the person to you past a certain point, then you win. Another one that could fall under this wild card event tree is any holding event. Now, I personally think holding events are boring. Sometimes they can be cool to watch when you start to see the competitors struggle a little bit. It's also really cool if a promoter will set it up mano a mano. Like, let's say you're holding a set of farmers handles, Dan, and I'm holding them as well. And they'll line us up mano a mano right across from each other. We get to stare at each other and see who goes down first. So every so often you'll see some events like that. This can also come in the form of a front hold. I actually did an event in July at Nationals called a Texas coin front hold, which ironically enough is how I hurt my forearm. But what it was, imagine like a big half empty coin that you could put plates in, and you have to extend your arms forward and just hold it as long as you can or until you break like I did. And it's a good test of strength. It's not particularly my favorite choice of event, but sometimes you're not going to like the events that are in the competition.
As you mentioned, there can be a wide array of events, and you might like the deadlift, but possibly not the deadlift variation that they're testing you on. So there's certainly a lot of prep that goes into this. One, from a GPP standpoint, and just having a big enough engine to do these things and having the physical resilience to do these things without injury. But also, you need a specific element to it as well, because the technical side of the lifting to a lot of these different apparatuses is very unique. It's different, and there's some exercises that carry over super well to them and some that don't. And kind of going back through the way you kind of broke it down there between deadlift, overhead press, carry, a loading event, and then a wild card. Looking at the deadlift first, I think most people or most gyms are familiar with the deadlift, and they have probably some kind of basic barbell. It might not be like a deadlift bar per se, but even if it's just like a Texas power bar and they've got plates, they can load it up that way. That's a great start. But, when it comes to some of these different things like the axle or like the car, that is still the most unique deadlift, if we want to call it deadlift variation, that I've done. So how do you go about taking some of these other variations and making them more trainable on a limited equipment basis?
So I'll start with the deadlift. I'll break each individual one down for you, but I want to start with the deadlift first. So the deadlift, honestly, getting better at deadlifting, simply just deadlift a lot more. I mean, the more that you deadlift, it's going to eventually increase. And I know that you just had Dr. Justin Clifford on talking about the deadlift. Highly recommend listening to that podcast or the two podcasts with him because he is a philosopher around the deadlift and has a very good understanding of how to build the deadlift and how it can translate not just to lifting but in life as well. But on top of that, when I'm building my deadlift training programming and I'm looking at what has been the most successful for me, there are two things that come to mind. First of all is speed and technique work, and also the barbell RDL. So I'll start with the speed and technique work. To me, the biggest thing when it comes to deadlift is routine. You want to keep the same routine. You want to try and replicate the same setup as much as possible because more often than not, when your setup is off, especially when you're picking up something weird like a frame or a car deadlift frame or an axle bar, if that setup is off by an inch or even a millimeter, like you're going to move the bar in a way that you're probably not going to like, and you're going to recruit muscles that may feel a little bit more painful as opposed to fluid. So for me, I like to incorporate the speed and technique days. What I mean by this is I'm going to take a much lighter percentage of what my 1 rep max is, and I'm going to try and get as many perfect reps as possible. So there's several different ways that you can break it down. The way that I particularly like to do it with myself is anywhere between 8 to 12 sets of 2. The reason being that I do two is my first rep is typically going to be all based on how I set it up. The second one is typically where my body wants me to be. And I will take my video from the side or at about a 45-degree angle to see what my foot positioning is looking like, what my hip positioning is looking like, where my back is, how my upper back is, am I too rounded, for example. But the biggest reason that I like those that double is that first rep. So if your first rep is off, you may see the bar shift a little bit away from you. You may see it shift a little bit towards you. You may see your hips shift up a little bit too early. That's where that first rep comes into play. And the other reason why I like it to be super light is ideally you should be able to control this weight with perfect form the entire way. If you can see your form starting to deteriorate with 50 to 60%, you got to correct something with your deadlift. You can't be overloading the bar and expecting better results. Even if the weight is going up, if it's looking like crap, eventually it's going to catch up with you. And another thing that I like to do with these technique and speed days is to add accommodating resistance. Now, not everybody has the capability of bands and chains. I'm a little bit more impartial to chains if you do have them available, because the chain is going to give you a little bit more of a true replica. Because as you go up with the deadlift, the weight gets a little bit heavier. And let's say you have a sticking point that's at your knees or mid shin, you will notice that it will start to slow down once the chains get off the ground to that point. So it's a good visualization technique for me to actually see where my weakest part of my deadlift is and how I can actually accelerate through that. I'm not a pause deadlift guy. I just want to say that. I know that was brought up on Dr. Justin's pod because the deadlift is an acceleration exercise. You are never taught and you never should stop your deadlift. So that is never in my programming. So that's one way that I work on the deadlift. Now, this could also vary depending on the type of implement that I'm experiencing. So for example, there's a competition that I'm looking to do where there's going to be a car deadlift and a frame carry. So I am fortunate enough to have both of those at my gym. But if you're not, your best bet is going to be a trap bar. Reason being, the deadlift frame and the car deadlift frame are going to have handles at your sides. So you want to try and work on building that type of deadlift as similar as possible to what you're going to face on competition. Now, obviously, the implement's going to be different on comp day. The way that you have to sort of push through the ground and lean back slightly on into the pivot point of the car deadlift is going to be slightly different. However, most of the mechanics are very similar in terms of how you have to set your lats, take your grip, breathe and brace. All of that is not really going to change all that much. So depending on the type of implement that you have, that's where I would lean into the trap bar a little bit for being your base lift if you don't have access to the implement. Then I'm going to talk about the barbell RDL. So the barbell RDL to me isn't just great because, you can load it pretty heavy, and I think you should load it pretty heavy. I think if you're going too light on the RDL, you might as well do speed work at that point, because you're just going to end up moving it too fast and it's not going to really benefit you all that much. When I'm looking at the RDL, I'm looking at building my posterior chain. I'm looking at building my glutes and my hamstrings. And for me, my sticking point is anywhere between my mid shin and my knees. If I can get it through that point, I'm going to lock out the lift. So the way that I train the barbell RDL, especially for strongman, is no matter what type of bar that I have in the competition, I'm going to obviously do a deadlift first. I want to do like a traditional deadlift first. I don't believe in picking it up from the rack because I don't think that's going to give you a true replica as to what you're going to be feeling throughout the range of motion. I think you might be relying too much on like a little barbell shrug to get it off of like pins, for example, if you set them up at your gym, at your commercial gym. So do a traditional deadlift first. And then when you're going down into your hinge, I will go down to where my sticking point is. Now, for other people, it may be different. Some people, it may be a little higher. Some people, it may be a little bit lower. So for me, since my sticking point is mid shin into my knee, I'm going to bring the barbell down to that point, and then I'm going to accelerate as fast as I possibly can on the way up. But when I'm bringing it down to my sticking point, I don't want to just launch it all the way down there. I want to control the weight, get to that point, and then accelerate up. So kind of like a pause deadlift, if you want to say that. But then let's say you're a little bit weaker off the floor. I still think you could train RDLs very similarly. So what you'll do, you'll pick the weight all the way up, except this time you're going to bring it to just before you hit the ground. Hold that for a little bit and then bring it on up, maybe like 1 to 2 seconds, and then go from there. On top of this, then let's say you have an axle barbell in a competition. Not everybody has a fat bar. It's getting a little bit more common in gyms. Some people may say, oh, you can add fat grips to it. That can help to a degree. The problem is fat grips have a little opening on the end. And what a lot of people will do is when they set them up, they'll actually grab towards the opening, which doesn't really do anything for you. If you do have fat grips, grab the side that is smooth, because that's going to be a little bit more similar to the axle. However, if you do not have an axle, I am not the biggest fan of the deficit deadlift. However, in this case, I will say that it will apply slightly to the axle because an axle bar is usually 2 inches thick around, which in theory, since the normal standard deadlift height is going to be around 9 inches, the axle deadlift from the start is going to be 8 inches off the ground. So what I would encourage you to do is, let's say you don't have an axle, take a regular bar and just do a 1-inch deficit deadlift from there. That's going to train you to get a little bit lower in your starting position, which may be a little bit more uncomfortable for you. But at the same time, it's going to get you used to all of the torque that you're going to need to get it off the ground. As far as building the grip strength for that, because with an axle deadlift and because with strongman, sometimes you'll be allowed to use straps. If you have straps, take advantage of them. Use them whenever you possibly can, because lifting with straps is highly different than lifting without them. And some people are actually worse with them, contrary to popular belief, because it does take a technique in setting them up properly, as you have found out, Dan. There is a difference between just putting them on the bar and then actually getting what you should get out of the straps. You need a little bit of wrist tension in there. You shouldn't just have your fingers around some straps and then grip and go. You're not going to be getting the most out of your straps there. But when it comes to building grip strength for something like the axle deadlift, I would encourage you to hold your deadlifts at lockout, whether it's like 1 to 2 seconds, or let's say you're at the end of your set and you wanted to do an extended hold from there. That can also be beneficial. Plus the fact it will also get you used to holding that lockout, because in strongman, you can really only get a rep if you get a down command. So get used to fully locking out your deadlifts. And if you want to hold it there a little bit longer, what I would also encourage you to do is don't just work your traditional, if you use a mixed grip on deadlift, don't just use your traditional one. Flip flop it every so often. So that way you're getting as much grip strength on both hands as evenly as you possibly can.
Yeah, I like that breakdown you just gave there on the deadlift, Jeff. And just to kind of run it back, first off, I think it comes from just having the ability to train the deadlift regularly and getting good at it, as you mentioned. If you're not able to, I'm going to say for guys, like if you're not deadlifting 405, 495, you probably need to chase that strength before you worry about all these different variations of the deadlift. So, really get that base level of strength down. I like your point on the trap bar. I like your point on the eccentrics as well and actually controlling things because I feel like you get so much more strength gain out of that component of the lift. Um, and on the grip point as well, I like the use of a prolonged hold at the end. And that applies to both the trap bar and the straight bar, right? Whatever
Correct.
you're going to be lifting, whatever apparatus, just get comfortable gripping that hard and heavy. And I'll even take it a step further to say that like there could be a day when you might not program a deadlift and you just go over there, load a bar and hold it. Um,
Correct.
I echo your point on being against pause deadlifts. There's another hot take that I have that might in some worlds carry over to the wagon wheel deadlift. I'm very against rack pulls. I just don't really see a whole lot of benefit of just deadlifting like a small portion of the range that way. But I guess if you're going to do a wagon wheel deadlift and you really want to train for that, you could, in theory, set the safety pins to the height of, where the wagon wheel would elevate the bar to and then just deadlift it from there.
So I have a mixed opinion on rack pulls. I like them and I hate them. I will tell you there are times in my training block where I will incorporate them to get a little bit of a heavy overload because you're going to be able to lift more weight because the weight is higher and it is off the ground. I will also say that I think if you are dealing with some form of an injury and going all the way through the range of motion, like especially a lower back injury, you're probably going to want to pivot to the rack pull just to get used to that feeling of sort of a deadlift. However, I will say I like the rack pulls because if, let's say, you do have a 13-inch deadlift coming up in a competition, another variation you may see is an 18-inch deadlift. Sometimes these are for reps, sometimes these are for max. There's even a deadlift variation called a silver dollar deadlift where you'll have a much wider bar. There will be attachments on a bar and it'll go out to like 10 feet. So what happens when you engage the pull is there's a heck of a lot of whip, but it takes a lot longer to get it off the ground. Typically the range of motion is much shorter, but the benefit of doing rack pulls in this case is it will get you used to holding that position and holding that tension for about 1 to 2 to maybe 3 seconds before the bar actually gets started. Otherwise, I am partial to training the deadlift off the floor simply because that's the most common area that you're going to see. That's the most common range of motion that you're going to see. And if you get used to being really good at rack pulls, but you find that you either are looking to do deadlift in a competition or even just recreational deadlifts, they are two totally different movements. The way that you set up, the way that you set up your back, especially. Like I actually talked about this with Greg the other day. In terms of your upper back, my upper back and lats get way more fatigued from a rack pull than, let's say, my lower back would because you're starting from a much higher position. Your torso is going to be in a much higher position from that point. So, I mean, if you need work on that weakness, go for it. But quite frankly, I don't think it is a lockout saver simply because what happens with rack pulls, especially above the knee, is they become really heavy barbell shrugs. And yes, you can get the initiation feeling of a deadlift, but I think you're missing the point of actually pushing your hips forward and locking it out. Because if you're relying on your upper back strictly to lock out a weight, you're losing out on, I would argue, hundreds of pounds because your hips should be the one that should be finishing the movement for you.
Yeah, no, definitely, definitely. And, the other piece too, as you mentioned, is it's not just training the deadlift, but training it in means that are specific to competition. So whether that's very heavy or if it's more of like a max rep event, I hope that you've done a little bit of higher rep work with the deadlift in prep for that. It's one of
Correct.
those things where I get caught myself into training very low reps because that's what I like to do. But
hmm
sometimes we need to break out of that mold a little bit for what we're actually going to see on, competition day or whatever that way.
So I'll give you an example to train around that. So let's say, Dan, you are somebody that likes working in the 3 to 5 set rep range. Which I get. Everybody doesn't want to do more than 5 reps because it feels like quote unquote cardio. In strongman, you're going to need a little bit more muscular endurance. You're also going to have to learn how to pace yourself, especially if it's a competition for reps. Typically, you're given 60 seconds on the clock and you have to do as many reps as possible. You will see two types of people at every show. You'll see the people that try to blitz through it and get as many reps as possible in 30 seconds, and then they usually might get 1 or 0 after that. Or you'll see the person that will try to go the full 60 seconds, pace themselves, control their breathing, take a knee if they need to recollect themselves. That can also be a way to, practice for like the actual longevity of the competition and save yourself so that way you don't blow all of your energy too early. So there's two ways that you can train this. Quite frankly, you can set up a clock and you can actually train the 4 reps format where, let's say, even if you're not doing your competition weight per se, because typically in strongman, if you're doing a 4 reps event, you're given a set amount of weight that you have to lift for as many times as possible. But if you're constantly training comp weight the whole time, you're going to be feeling like trash going into the comp. So a way that I like to kind of wave that is, let's say we're about 4 weeks out and we're like towards or I'll say 5 weeks because I typically deload the week of a competition. I'm going to take 80% of my comp weight and I'm going to do at least one set where I'm going to go 60 seconds, as many reps as possible, then 85, then 90, 95. So that way I'm gradually increasing it on the way up. So I'm getting to a peak and then I deload after that. That's one way that you can train yourself to get used to what the competition setting will feel like, but it will also help you work on your muscular endurance and get your lungs prepared for that type of toll that it's going to take on you. However, if you're somebody that really likes to work in the lower rep ranges, let's say 2 to 5 rep range, so you're still getting a lot of strength work there, but at the same time you want to get a lot of the rep work in there. What I like to do is I like to increase the amount of sets that I'll do, and this is something that I learned from Brian Olsru a long time ago. Because he was just like you. He didn't like doing a lot of sets with a lot of reps. So I'm going to add the amount of sets that I'm going to do as opposed to the amount of reps that I'm going to do. So instead of doing your standard 3 sets of 10 or 3 sets of 8, just flip it around. 10 sets of 3, 8 sets of 3, or also you could play around with a rep range too. Like let's say you're feeling really good that day and you want to make it a 3 to 5. That can also work. So that way you're still staying in that strength threshold, but also working the amount of total tonnage that you need to be prepared for a 4 reps event. Now, the other thing that is paramount in this is your rest times. So when I'm thinking of 8 sets of 3, and let's say that it's a weight that is really challenging for me, let's say 80% and above, I'm probably going to want to have my rest anywhere between 2 to 3 minutes because I want to make sure that I'm getting the maximum amount of output that I'm going to put into that deadlift session. However, let's say that it's a weight that you could throw around pretty easily. Change your rest periods. Make it maybe a minute to 2 minutes and don't go beyond that. So that way you're not spending hours at the gym doing one particular exercise, but it's something where it's like, okay, I'm kind of banging this out really quickly. And that gives you the stimulus that's similar to the 4 reps event, where you feel like you have to kind of be prepared all the time. But at the same time, your lungs are working a lot because that minute goes by really quick.
I think those are great training points too that are going to apply to more than just the deadlift. We'll see that same thing in variations of, like, say, the overhead press as well, right? Like,
Yes.
overhead press is an area too where I like to just push the strength and I don't like to do like a lot of volume work, but this is an area where sometimes we need it. And with the overhead press, I usually, just in my own training, I do a lot of barbell work. This is another hot take. I know most people love dumbbells for overhead press, and I think that they have good utility for most people. I just personally don't program them for myself. I think the log press was probably the most challenging thing I've done because holding that log way up high and like tipped back, like you have to extend up top there to really get it to rest comfortably and kind of create that like shelf-like position, for lack of a better way to put it. And I've struggled to find things that replicate that other than maybe like a multi-grip football bar, Swiss bar, whatever you prefer to
Hmm.
call it, kind of having that kind of neutral position. And I mean, some of these other ones like circus dumbbell, there's a certain point where I almost wonder if you just need the apparatus itself. You know what I mean?
So I'll tell you, overhead is a little bit more challenging. My disclaimer for anything in regards to strongman is the implement is always going to be better across
Mhm.
the board. When it comes to your take on dumbbells, I don't think you're entirely wrong. Simply because however you hold the dumbbell is not going to be the same as a 12-inch log laying across your chest. So I'm going to get a little weird on you to try and give you a replica here because it's not going to be a true overhead press replica. I'm going to give you two accessories that I have found that have helped make my overhead press better across the board. You may like the first one. The second one is a little bit trickier. So the first one is going to be a front squat hold. So what you're going to do is this isn't necessarily just going to be something that you build your front squat with. And it's not always going to just be your front squat position. I don't care how you get into the front squat, whether you're using straps, whether you have the bar on your fingers, whether you cross your arms, or if you want to zombie it, go for it. I don't care how you do it. But when it comes to the front squat holds, I will train it in three different capacities. I will train it as if I am doing a front squat. All I'm going to do is overload the bar. So let's say, for example, your front squat max is 300 pounds. I'm going to take about 10% above whatever that is, so about 330, and I'm going to set the rack just below where I would pick it up and just stand up and hold it, and I'm going to hold that for about anywhere between 10 to 15 seconds. And the whole entire time, you're probably going to be shaking. You're probably going to be turning into a balloon. This is where not just your breathing and your bracing comes into play, but your upper back strength. Your upper back strength is going to be your game changer when it comes to anything overhead press and strongman. That's not just with lockout, but that's mostly with stabilizing the implements themselves. So the alternative to training it this way is think about how you would hold an axle bar or a standard barbell, and then think about how you would hold a log press. So what I'm going to do in that case, let's say that it's a log press. Now, obviously, you can't get the neutral grip feeling that you would with a standard log. But what I would do is I would put my hands where I would need to be for the log press. And then at that point, instead of just keeping my shoulders tight in the front rack position, I'm actually going to flare my lats a little bit. So it's going to feel a little unconventional to a typical front squat. I'm not saying that that's not a cue that you can use for a front squat, but it may be a little bit abnormal. But you need to flare your lats and get those shoulders and lats nice and tight. So that way, when you take your dip and drive with the log, it's not going to collapse forward on you. So in this case, with the front squat hold, you hold it in that position. Again, 10 to 20 seconds. And this is going to be heavy, but again, just measure it off of your front squat max. Then when it comes to, let's say, the axle, for example, your axle grip is probably going to be either a little bit more wider or a little bit more narrow than your typical log press will be. But instead, the lats are probably not going to be flared as much. You're probably going to have your elbows driven a little bit more forward than you would the log press, simply because the log is going to push those elbows down a little bit. So this is going to be very similar to a traditional front squat and a traditional Olympic rack position, Olympic clean and press rack position. Again, pick it up, hold it anywhere between 10 to 20 seconds. I've found in my own training that 5 sets is typically enough, because after that, I've noticed that I start to get a little bit of the thoracic rounding, and then that's not going to be good for anybody. That's going to start creating the bad habits, and then what happens is when you get to the heavier weights again, you're going to start pushing forward every time you go. So that's one way that I create a better rack position. The second thing that I've found that has been the most beneficial in terms of accessory work, and then I'm actually going to get into a lift that I do to replicate all of the strongman overhead presses. And this is with dumbbells, by the way, but the actual accessory is a close grip lat pull down. So I found this a long time ago from a guy by the name of Zach Gallman. He was a columnist with Lead FTS. He won Strongman Nationals in 2019, heavyweight guy, Olympic lifting background as well. So what you're going to want to look for is the attachment that you may see for like a low row at your cable or on the cable machines at the gym. It's going to look something like a triangle or a pyramid. You're going to want to put that on whatever lat pull down you have, or even if you have bands or smaller cables, you can still do the same thing. You're going to grip the handles with a neutral grip. And when you pull down, you're going to notice that your lats are going to be in that same exact position they need to be in when you're racking the log up top. So same concept as with the front squat holds. You're going to want to flare your lats and get those shoulders really tight, and then pull down, holding that tension the entire time. Because some people may find that when they're doing the lat pull down at the gym, man, why am I feeling this in my biceps? Why am I feeling this in my forearms? Why am I feeling like I'm pulling a lot with my fingers? Because you're not using your lats properly. So when you're doing this, again, you have to flare the lats, keep the tension as much as possible, and pull down in that position. What that's going to do is that's going to build the lats for your front rack when the log is on your chest at the top. So that's my number one accessory for building anything overhead. Because if you looked at axle too, like even though you're not in the neutral grip position, when you have to bring your lats to a set position, it's virtually in the same spot as the closed grip lat pull down. As far as programming goes, I don't think you need any more than 8 to 12 reps on this. Train it a little heavier if you're going to 8, train it a little bit medium intensity if you're going to 12. As far as building the actual lift itself, if you do not have the implement, this is where I do like the dumbbells. Now, in regards to how you can set this up, I don't think you actually need to always do dumbbell clean and overhead press, because quite frankly, it's way too damn easy. You're able to get so much pop on such a short range of motion with the dumbbells that I'm not the biggest fan of it. However, I will do it if it is absolutely necessary. When you are doing dumbbell, if you're trying to get ready for log, obviously you're going to work with a neutral grip. And as Dan talked about earlier, you're going to have to rack the dumbbells on top of your shoulders, and your wrists are going to have to be flared towards you. What this means is it'll push your elbows forward, kind of similar to a front squat in a sense, but the dumbbells are resting on your shoulders. Now, the only problem with something like this is with the log press, it's a lot more cumbersome. And the dumbbells are isolated on your shoulders, whereas the log will be a solid object that's going to be across your face. And if you're doing this correctly, when you're doing the log press, your eyes are going to be looking to the ceiling, because if the log is high enough on your chest, you shouldn't be able to look forward and see anything in front of you. So what I would encourage you to do is get a little bit, and this may go against a lot of people's opinions, but slight upper back rounding towards the back, because the log is going to tilt you towards the back. I'm not saying Eddie Hall it, where he tries to do a standing bench press. Slight upper back round backwards, lean back with the dumbbells, get your dip and drive as you normally would, and then press overhead. However, me personally, I think incline dumbbell bench press is a better builder than any of these if you do not have a log or an axle at your gym. Reason being, so as I mentioned, you're going to have that slight upper background at the top. So where your lockout is going to come into play is you're going to need power from your pecs, you're going to need power from your shoulders, and you're going to need power from your triceps. So depending on the implement that you're using, if you're using a log, I am a big fan of doing neutral grip here. And if I'm training for log in a contest or even circus dumbbell, whether you use one arm, or if you're dominant with one arm, let's say you're right-handed, so you only use your right hand, you still want to train both sides because you don't want to create an imbalance that way. But if you're training something that you have to press with a neutral grip, like a circus dumbbell or a log, you're going to want to do it neutral grip, because more often than not, that's the grip that you're going to hold. So that's why I like the incline bench. And what I would encourage you to do is don't do a typical incline like a 45-degree or a 60-degree. You might want to go slightly higher, so maybe like a 30-degree tilt on the bench. I know I'm getting really particular here, so it kind of borders a military press / incline bench, but you want to get used to a slight round back, a round upper back, and then press from there. The only change that you would make with axle is you would just shift to your typical standard barbell grip from there, and then press overhead.
I like the use of the front squat hold to really help get more comfortable here. I like the lat pull down to really help, that cue of, feeling the lats and all that way.
Hmm.
My little, like, I guess it's just my bias. I might switch it to a neutral grip pull up hold.
Okay.
I really like me being me, I have to like pull ups, I
Of
feel.
course. Of course. You are the
Um,
pull-up guy. And
so I personally feel like with the pull up, I can just really hammer like the grip component of squeezing the bar really hard. I can
mhm,
also change a little bit more of that back position by leaning away or
correct.
staying straight upright here. And I think that lean away neutral grip pull up hold, especially if you load that sucker, would probably have a lot of carryover as well.
I would
I,
agree. I would also encourage you with the weighted pull-up, do more than one rep.
yes,
Because more often than not, if you're going in a competition, you're going to see a 4 reps contest. Now, if you're going for a max rep contest where you're trying to do as much weight as possible, that's where I'm partial to what you were saying, where I'm going to do that pull up hold. Get me an isometric in that position where I have to hold and stay stable as long as possible. Because typically with a heavier weight, when you're going for a max attempt, you have to slow down a little bit. So if you can't stay in that position for more than a second, you're probably going to drop the log anyway. So if you're going 4 reps, I would look anywhere between the 3 to 6 rep range and load that sucker really heavy.
yeah, definitely. And I love your point about the use of the dumbbells as well. I am a little surprised that you didn't bring up push press variation at some point though, because I know for me that's one thing I really struggled with is getting that vertical power transfer from my hips up overhead into my shoulders. And I think that that's something that if you can do it, can certainly make the overhead component go a lot smoother for you.
I do agree with you. I was thinking more so if you didn't even have a barbell.
Yeah.
But I can speak on the push press variations for you. So the biggest thing that I will tell you, if you do have the barbell available,
Mhm.
is I'm a big fan of working complexes.
Yep.
So anyone who's not familiar with the complex is I'm going to be doing different parts of the lift and breaking down different parts of the lift so that way we can see where you're starting to struggle and then go from there. You can also get a lot of work done in a short amount of time. So I'll give you an example. Have the implements, but let's say that we didn't. So he has a really big problem with holding his lockouts and holding his rack position. So the complex that we did this time around was clean to your chest, strict press overhead, hold it there for about 3 seconds, and then bring it down with a slower controlled eccentric, anywhere between 3 to 5 seconds. And you're controlling that bar the entire time. You're not trying to just let it flop back onto your chest. Then when you get to your chest and your delts, you hold it again for another 3 to 5 seconds. This is where something like the front squat isos will come into play, where you have to maintain that nice upper back position to where you're not rounding too far forward or too far back, and then you bring it down back down to the ground. Typically, when I'm doing complexes, I treat it more as a warm up. But if you wanted to treat it as your main mover, I found that I can incorporate anything from a strict press, push jerk, split jerk. If you want to learn all those different disciplines all in one, I found that doing typically 3 to 5 rounds of this and anywhere between 3 to 5 reps of each has been good. So let's say you want to learn how to push press. So what I've found, there are 2 issues that I usually see with the push press is knees going forward or 3 issues I'll say. Knees going forward, knees caving, and your hips are not underneath of you when you're actually taking your leg drive. So what I like to practice, let's give you a sample complex for this. So you clean the barbell to your chest. And when you're doing these complexes at first, I encourage you to use extremely light weight so that way you can actually get used to what the movement should feel like. Um, I'll give you like my numbers, for example. I've overhead pressed 335 over my head, and I might work with 95 pounds just to break down the technique, see where I'm slipping, see where I'm on point. So what I'll do is I'll take the barbell, clean it to my chest, and then I'm going to go into my leg drive. I don't want you to go into a full squat. I don't want you to even really go into a quarter squat. I want you to get your take a dip, push your knees out as you're going down, And I encourage you to take a video from the side, because what you're going to see is, all right, are my hips in line how they should be? Are they pushed too far forward? Are they pushed too far back? And if I push my knees forward, typically what's going to happen is my hips are going to collapse either too far forward or too far back. And then the upper back starts to move all over the place. So what you'll do is you'll take your leg drive and you'll hold it for anywhere between 1 to 2 seconds, and then explode out of your press from there. Again, when you're taking this video from the side, that's when I'm looking at my feet. So what you want to do when you're getting your leg drive is you want to get what's called triple extension. So when you're doing this properly, the barbell is going to stay in line with your body. If you're not doing this properly, either your feet are going to be glued, or the bar is going to push out in front, and you need to actually bend your upper back in order to get the press over your head. So what we're looking for here is, as you're pushing your knees out against the ground, or pushing your knees out as you're taking your leg drive, when you're driving through your heels should almost look like you're coming off the ground ready to fly, and it will look like you're on your tippy toes. But when you come back and actually catch the press at the top, your heels are going to land back down. So then the second part of the complex from there is to hold that lockout, because that's what you're ultimately going to have to do in strongman in order to get a down call. So just like in that example complex that I gave you, 3 to 5 seconds, hold it there, whatever your lockout position is. Then, depending on what your weaknesses is, I actually really like an overhead shrug, especially if you're doing this at a lighter weight. So what you're doing at this point is you're keeping your arms fully extended. And from there, you're going to shrug up as high as you possibly can, where you have a lot of built up tension in your neck and traps. And you'll notice you may even push your head forward, head through the window, as some people will call it, so that way you can get a little bit more of a definitive lockout. What I'll do from there, these aren't going to be a timed hold. This is going to be something like 3 to 5 reps. And then you bring the bar back down slowly. Again, another 3 to 5 second eccentric on the way down. Hold it again in your rack position, and then bring the bar back down to the ground. So if you do the math, Dan, at this point, we've paused on our dip and drive right here. We've accelerated at the top. We're holding it again for 3 to 5 seconds. Then we're doing like 3 to 5 reps of these overhead shrugs. We then bring it down back to our chest, holding it again, and then we finally end. That's like 30 to 40 seconds of work with one rep. So just consider that. That's one rep of a complex. I would encourage you that if you're looking to learn any type of lift, whether it's a push press, push jerk, strict press, split jerk, break down each individual movement, each part of each individual movement, and pause at each part and see where your weakest point is, and then work from there.
Yeah, I love the use of the complex like that. And it's funny because that's a very similar approach to what I use for someone right now with the Turkish get up in the kettlebell world, right? Like there's 7 different positions. And it's like, well, we can pause at each one, hold for 5 seconds. Yes, it makes the whole exercise take like a minute to go up and a minute to go down, but it is such a good way to really own those positions and get really good at the lift. So I certainly love the use of the complex here for the overhead work. And, to a certain extent, you'd be able to apply that to other exercises as well. It doesn't have to be just an overhead thing.
Correct.
It's funny, when we get to the carries, I feel like this is the part where it's just like, well, grip it and rip it, right? Like
To
get something heavy, carry
to
it.
to a degree. I think this is where my disclaimer of it's always better to have the implement applies almost more than everything, and then the next chapter with loading as well. However, there are ways to get around it. So, most dumbbells in gyms, I'll say, will typically go up to anywhere between 100 to 150 pounds. Sometimes you're even more limited than that with like the 75-pound range. Now, I mean, I can tell you from a personal experience, I actually just wrote a program for a 64-year-old man, and he's doing farmer's walks with the heaviest dumbbells that he possibly can. So, what I have found is what most people will do if they're trying to use dumbbells as a training tool for farmer's walk is they will try to run them as fast as possible. I am wholeheartedly against this, and I will tell you why. I think there are many other ways that you could train foot speed, especially if you don't have the implements themselves, and that can even be done on air with body weight. In regards to training the farmer's walk, the two biggest problems that people will usually have is they either can't pick it up or they can't stabilize it. So let's say you have an issue with the pickup. This is where you would have to do something like a really low dumbbell neutral grip deadlift from the bottom. Now, I am not the biggest fan of these. I think it puts you in a really bad position. That being said, if that's what you have, that's where I'm probably going to lean into to get used to it. Do not pick these up off of the dumbbell rack. Pick them up off the ground. Because again, this comes back to your rack pull point. You're not going to be getting used to that full range of motion. I would rather you go a little bit beyond what you're going to be used to in competition than not. As far as the stabilization goes, typically a lot of people, when it comes to grip strength, hold the bar or the implement themselves way too high on their hands. So the farmer's walk implement, for example, let's say that that's the implement that you're using, will slip out and fall onto the ground. What I would encourage you to do is take a set of dumbbells, and this doesn't necessarily have to be if you're doing like a heavy farmer's walk or anything like that. This is a hand drill to practice. Take your hand and wrap it or put your hand right up against the dumbbell and then wrap it around. Now, when you squeeze the dumbbell, the next step I want you to do is to crank your wrist inward. What that's going to do is that's going to create a skin fold. So from there, once you've created that skin fold, crank it back outward and pull your lat down. What you're doing at that point is you're creating not only a lot of extra tension in your upper back, so that way you're going to be solid when you start moving with the weight itself, but you're also putting the weight even deeper into your hand. So ideally, my callus are going to be in the middle of my hand with a red pinch mark, because that's what it is going to feel like, as opposed to having it much higher up on your hand. Because what happens when you start moving with these things, whether it's dumbbells or anything, is they start rotating in your hands. So what I'm trying to do at this point is I'm trying to nullify how much movement I'm getting in my hands. So then from there, let's say you've got the dumbbells. All right, now you want to walk with them. I am a proponent of taking really ginger steps with really heavy weight. And what I'm going to do then is, let's say I set a distance for 40 to 60 feet. So by taking the ginger steps, I'm doing or adding a lot more time under tension, building up not only my hand strength, but also my upper back strength to stay in line. And then from there at the end, this is where I'm either going to add a shrug, because farmers requires a lot of extra trap work, a shrug and hold, or I'll do, like, let's say 10 shrugs for reps, or I'll just do a static hold in that position for another 10 to 15 seconds. So with farmers, you need stabilization and grip. That's one alternative that I have to training that. Now, let's say your carrying event is something like a sandbag or a keg. This is where it gets a little bit more challenging, because sandbags and kegs, they're going to be a lot heavier than your typical medicine ball that you're going to see in the gym. However, if you're not able to necessarily load up a medicine ball to, let's say, 200 pounds, I don't think there is a reason to not do a medicine ball front carry. I will also tell you there is not a reason to do even a stability ball front carry. So what I will do with the stability ball or the medicine ball, I will take two particular exercises to build up strength for that. First things first, obviously you got to pick it up off the ground, very similar to a sandbag or a keg. From there, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stand up and I'm going to squeeze it and push it into my chest, because these implements are always going to be cumbersome and they're always going to be against you. So what you're doing at this point is you're creating a lot of tension in your upper back, but at the same time, you're also pushing inward, squeezing with your pecs, your forearms, and your hands against you. So what you're getting used to now is holding that object against your body. Another thing that I will do is, let's say that your gym has a glute ham raise. What I will do then, because what happens with these carrying events, especially if it's a front loaded carry like a sandbag or a keg, is your hamstrings are going to get really tired, because you have to move forward with these implements. And since they're a little cumbersome in front of you, you may eventually lean back a little bit to try and get it higher on your chest. So your hamstrings might get a little bit on overload there. So I will do this for not only carrying, but also loading. I will hold a medicine ball or a stability ball, just like I talked about, where I am squeezing it against my body the entire time. And I will do glute ham raises with varying degrees of weight or almost no weight whatsoever. And my focus there is I'm either going to hold it and do an isometric at the bottom and then squeeze all the way at the top like a typical Nordic curl, or I will do it as explosively as possible. Depending on if I'm doing a sprint, I want to be a little bit more explosive. If I'm doing a max distance carry, or if I'm doing a really heavy stone load, I'm going to want to control the weight a little bit more that way. So let's say, for example, you want to actually apply this and load the sucker, because we all know that we love loading the sucker. We all love putting a lot of heavy weight on things. So this is where Dan's favorite Zerchers come into play. Now, I am not saying that you should be doing Zercher walks with your barbell in the gym. This is not safe. You could get somebody hurt. You can get somebody killed. I don't want that to be the case. So there are two alternatives that I like to use for not only carrying, but also for loading as well. So let's say you have a sandbag or a keg in a competition. This is where I like to work on the pick portion of the lift with a Zercher triple extension. So what I'm going to do, this could either be with a barbell or a safety squat bar. Safety squat bar is preferred in this case, because
which way is the camber facing on the SSB for this?
So the camber is going to be facing away from you. The camber is going to be facing away from you because with the front carry, since the weight is going to be out in front of you, I want that weight pushing as far away as possible. So what you're going to do, ideally, if you have an SSB and you have handles that can be removed, remove those handles, because if not, they're just going to hit you and that's not going to feel great. If you can't do that, you're just going to have to deal with a little extra pain. So what you're going to do is you're going to set the pins and the bar on the pins super, super low, because what you're trying to replicate is that pick off the ground. Now, as far as weight goes, that's ultimately up to you. I typically like to work around weights that are weights that I'm going to be feeling for comp weight. But if that's way too light of an experience, just keep adding a little bit more weight on there. What I've found is I've done Zercher triple extensions with anything from like 400 to 450 is like really, really heavy work, but I actually get a lot of really good work with like 300 for myself. And I'm carrying anything between a 220 to 265, sometimes 300-pound sandbag. So if you need that as a reference, that's a decent proportion there. So what you're going to do is you're going to line your forearms and your elbows up like you would for a typical Zercher around the SSB. Now realize, because your upper back is going to be a little bit rounded, this is going to be sort of similar to going down and picking up an Atlas stone, a sandbag, or a keg off the ground. From there, what you're going to do is you're going to squeeze really tight and pull the bar into your chest. Squeeze it as if you were squeezing that, trying to get that implement off the ground. And then from there, you're going to scoop up and extend as high as you possibly can with your heels. Now, this is meant to be an explosive movement. This is not meant to be a really fast movement. So if you're in a gym, you're going to make a lot of noise. So you explode up as fast as you possibly can. And then if you want to try and control the eccentric, you can slow it on the way down and then drop it down. But it's going to be a lot harder to do that with this exercise. I will tell you that. Then you bring it back down and repeat. So say, for example, you're going for a max rep sandbag over a bar in a competition. This is if you're doing loading. You're going to want to load this up really heavy. If you're going for reps in a competition, you're going to want to still load this heavy, but you're going to want to do anywhere between, I would say, 3 to 8 reps, because typically in a strongman comp, if you have a properly loaded loading event, you're going to need anywhere between, I'll say, 6 to 12 reps to win. If it's any more than 12, it's going to be a rep fest. So you don't need to do a ton of reps on this, but what you need to focus on is being explosive, extending through your hips, while also making sure that you are squeezing your upper body the entire time throughout this movement. So how would you train this for a carrying event? So I've kind of given you a little bit more of the loading implementation with this. As far as a carrying event goes, I would encourage you to still pick it from the bottom. Again, this is going to be much lower than your typical Zercher pickup. So like if you like setting up your Zerchers where it's right at arm height and then you step out and go from there, I want you to go set the pins to about at least your knees, maybe even lower than that if you can. Some racks are not equipped to do that. If your rack is not equipped to do that, don't test the integrity of it. You're probably going to rip it out of the ground. But I would encourage you to go anywhere between like mid shin to your knee for the pins. You're going to scoop up under that, extend up as fast as you possibly can, just like you would if you're picking up a sandbag, going from the lap to the extended position, and then you're going to do marches in place. Now, these marches are going to be fast. In this case, I don't want you to worry about getting your knees up as high as possible, because that's not going to score you points in strongman. In strongman, when you're doing a moving event, you want to focus on moving your feet a little bit quicker, because that's going to allow you to stabilize the implement. If your strides get too long, then there's a little bit greater chance for instability, and then you drop the implement or you fall to the ground. Either way, that's what's going to happen. So in this case, what I want you to do, even though you're going to be marching in place, I want you to move your feet as fast as you possibly can. Now, let's say that you have a max distance carrying event. Typically, people tend to tire out anywhere between, I'll say, 30 to 60 seconds. So that's the timing range that I'd like to work on for the marches. This could get really sucky really quick, but this is where I have to say embrace the suck, and you got to deal with it. If you're working for a competition that's more sprint style, so let's say you have like a sandbag carry that's 50 feet, and the fastest time wins. Typically, a winning event is going to be 10 seconds or lower. So this is where you may want to incorporate in your programming shorter bursts. So 5 to 10-second sets. And I would argue you could go anywhere between 5 to 10 rounds here. The only thing is with your rest periods, that depends on how heavy the weight actually is. So let's say this Zercher extension is really, really heavy for you. This is where I'm going to encourage you to probably go for 90 seconds to 2.5 minutes of rest, just because you got to recover from that initial pickup. The short burst with your feet is not going to be as taxing as the actual pickup itself. However, if the pickup that you're using isn't necessarily that hard, you could go anywhere between 30 to 60-second rests and crank these bad boys out. So you're getting really quick conditioning in a short amount of time.
Yeah, no, I like that point, and I like the use of the time and altering the rest periods here. And to your point on the conditioning, I think this is a much different conditioning than most people think about. We've said that throughout this podcast, and we've even said it in past podcasts. You know, most people, they hear conditioning and they think assault bike sprints. Then they try a like long distance carry, and it's like everything hurts, everything is on fire. And that's more of the conditioning we're after. So more of an endurance training for the muscles we're after, plus high heart rate and high VO2 demand, because we're working so much tissue.
Correct.
I like those points. I like how you broke down the Zercher triple extension. I like the use of, earlier you touched on the glute ham raise, and I think that plays an important role here as well. Especially, you know, considering the fact that we're carrying something while trying to move fast in competition. And if we're moving fast, there is going to be a lot of load through some of these other structures, like the hamstring, for example. So I want to make sure that we don't really have any weak link in the system when it comes to these carrying type events that way. And I think, did we touch on the SSB step up that you mentioned for the yoke?
Not yet, not yet. Just one really quick point to circle back to what I was talking about with the carrying and the loading.
Yep.
I cannot emphasize enough the importance of squeezing. So
Yes.
if you are doing, whether it's the Zercher extension, the medicine ball carries, or even the medicine ball or stability ball glute ham raises, I cannot overemphasize enough pulling into your body and really squeezing that implement super hard, because the second that you don't do that, your shoulders start to relax, and then you may get a little elbow flexion, and then boom, there goes your bicep.
Right.
So this is where that is paramount from start to finish. The second that that starts to go, you'll notice that the implement gets lower and lower on your body. It almost gets to your stomach, and then boom, it's on the ground. So just didn't want to cut you off, but I can't emphasize that enough. You need to maintain strong upper back, strong squeeze strength the entire time.
Yeah.
Onto the SSB step up. So this is something, not everybody has a yoke. It's getting a little bit more common, even at your physical therapy clinic. I know that you guys have a yoke thanks to Dr. Greg. But the yoke is typically seen, I would say, in more strength training gyms. CrossFit boxes are seeing it a lot more now because CrossFit is bridged a little bit more into the strongman game, which I love. I'm not a trasher of CrossFit in that regard. That being said, let's say you do not have a yoke in your gym. So this is an implement where you have two beams, a cross member, and you load it at the bottom. The biggest thing that I've found that has carried over for me is an SSB step up. Now, you can do this with a barbell, but it's not the same, simply because the standard barbell doesn't require as much core stability, I would argue, and especially T-spine mobility at the top as the SSB would. Plus the fact with the camber on the SSB, it's going to want to throw you forward, which is kind of similar to what you're going to experience with the yoke, because when you're doing a yoke carry, you're always going to be moving forward. So you have to get used to that forward momentum. So that's why I prioritize the SSB over the barbell in this case. But these aren't your typical step ups. This isn't stepping up onto a box. This isn't trying to get your knee really high. This isn't trying to focus on getting really high hip drive. What we are focusing on here is we're trying to load this up pretty heavily. So let's say you're getting ready for a 500-pound yoke carry. What I would do is, instead of set the SSB up to a height that you feel comfortable with, where it's just a subtle pickup, because the yoke, you're going to get about 6 inches of clearance from the ground. So gauge that for how you set up your rack height. Now, you can do it the dangerous way that I did during the pandemic, where you set up 2 metal plates on the ground, you step out from the squat rack, you step around the plates, and then you step up onto the plates. Or you could do it the intelligent way, and you can flip the bar around to where you are stepping outwards from the rack. So this is different than your typical unrack from a squat, where you step up, then you take a couple steps, set your feet, and then go. This time, you're stepping up, stepping towards the 2 metal plates on the ground. I typically like a thin metal 45 over a bumper, because in my experience, the bumper plate has kind of shifted a little bit on the ground, and I don't want to blow anything, drop the bar, et cetera, et cetera. That could just end really poorly. So then what you're going to do is you have two options with what you're going to do with your hands. I don't know what to do with my hands. So with the SSB, you have the handles in front of you. This time, you're not going to use them. You have two options. You're either going to grab wide on the SSB where the camber is, or you're going to go hands-free. In front of you, on the metal 45s, you are stepping up, but what you're focusing on is moving your feet quickly. Because again, just like when I talked about with the carrying points from earlier with the sandbag, and when you're doing the Zercher marches, your focus in strongman is keeping your strides a little bit shorter, but your steps a lot faster. That's what's going to allow you to maintain the swing of the implement from not going too far back and forth. So at this point, you're practicing moving your feet as quickly as possible. As far as duration, very similar. You're not going to see to the sandbag and keg. You're not typically going to see max distance yoke carries, because more often than not, yoke carry is going to be the heaviest event in the contest. I've seen it here and there, but I'm going to say it's not as popular. Typically, what you're going to be used to is like a 50-foot straight shot, a 60-foot straight shot, every so often a 100-foot straight shot, or you'll get 50 feet down, reset it, 50 feet back. So I'll break it down on how you would prepare for each one. So let's say you've got a 50-foot straight shot. Again, 10 seconds or under is typically the typical duration that it will be needed to win. So what I will do in that case is I'll do a 5 to 10 second burst. I'll either have my hands wide or hands free on the SSB, and I'm going to raise whatever foot is my first step up onto the weights, put the second one on, then step off really quick. Step on, step off, step on, step off, as many reps as possible in that 5 to 10 second range. I've typically found that you could treat this like typical EMOM style. So if you wanted to go 5 to 10 rounds, maybe even a little bit more than that, go for it. It's not typically that taxing on anything other than your core and your upper back. So I found that I've been able to last a little bit longer with that. Let's say you have the event where it's a 50-foot carry, and then you have to turn around and bring it back. So this is where you're actually going to treat it like a cluster set. Again, you're going to do that 5 to 10 second burst. Then you're going to walk back, put it back in the rack, then wait for about, I'd say 2 to 3 seconds, because that's typically how long it takes to shift, get yourself set, and then get restarted going back towards the other way, and then walk back out, hit your burst again. Then, as far as the rest period goes there, instead of treating it more EMOM style, every minute on the minute, where you go at the top of every minute, I would then shift the rest period to about 90 seconds, maybe even 2 minutes, because at that point, you've done a full yoke run. So that's where I'm going to want to give a little bit more rest, even though we took a short break in between, just because we're actually going a greater distance in a shorter amount of time.
Yeah, no, I like that breakdown, and that does allow you to hit the varied distances in a more like gym type setting with just the use of a rack and an SSB that way. I also like the hands-free SSB here. I'm a little biased because I love my Hatfield exercises,
Hmm.
which are great, but in reality, the yoke is a very unstable event where that thing's going to be swinging all over the place. The SSB by nature is probably more stable than the yoke is, so we might want to go hands free to make up for that lack of stability somewhere else.
Now, I will
So
tell you this real quick, Dan, not to cut you off, but this also depends on what your actual setup is going to be on the yoke. So you, for example, you like to have your hands high on the crossbar. So if you're going to do these SSB step ups, as you mentioned, you do create a little bit more instability with the hands free, but I want you to practice getting your lats tight, pulling the bar down by getting your hands in that exact position, still with the SSB, but it's going to give you more practice with how the actual yoke will feel whenever you have that on competition day.
And I think the ability to create that stability is essential. And I know that's a point that we've come back to over and over again. But, in reality, we're not working just one muscle group with any of these, it's everything. So having the ability to create that tension and keep that tension throughout the entire body is really essential for all of these things that we've talked about so far. And I know it's also going to be essential when we get into like the loading stuff as well, is any kind of odd object thing that way. It's meant to be weird to carry, it's meant to be weird to work with. So if you can't keep tension in your body and that thing shifts, who knows what could happen.
Correct. So this is where I'm going to come back to the medicine ball. Now, again, Atlas stones, sandbags, kegs, if you have that implement, it is always going to be paramount. But the biggest issues that people typically have with loading, again, similar to carrying, they can't pick it up off the ground, or they can't extend high enough to actually get the implement onto the platform. So one thing that I have really enjoyed is medicine ball rows. Now, again, this is not going to necessarily be something that is really heavy, but I do have a heavy alternative coming up after this. So what your focus is going to be here is digging your hands underneath of the ball as deep as you possibly can. What this is going to get you used to doing is something in strongman we call crushing the fingers. So what you're doing when say this is you put your palms underneath of, let's say it's a sandbag, keg, stone, or in this case, a medicine ball. From there, you're going to shake your hands and the implement itself back and forth. And what you're doing the entire time is you're moving your hand and your wrist further underneath. When you put your wrist underneath of the implement, you want to curl it up. What you're doing at this point is you're creating tension. So this allows you to essentially squeeze the implement with not only your hands and your fingers, but also your wrists. What you're doing from there is then pushing your forearms against that implement as well. This is where the squeeze strength comes into play. So from here, I am just working on the pickup portion, because the portions of the loading events is going to be the pick, the lap when you take the implement and put it into your lap and you're sitting down with the implement itself, and then the load and extension. So we're just focusing on the pick portion here. So what I like to do is I will pick the medicine ball up, straight arms, pushing. You do not want to flex your elbows or your biceps here, because this is how the blown biceps happen a lot. So you need to make sure that your shoulders and upper back are super tight when you do this. And all you're doing when you get your hands underneath of this medicine ball is you squeeze and you push up to about your knees. The reason why you're just going up to your knees is typically, whether it's a sandbag, keg, Atlas stone, just as my 3 generic examples there. Once you clear your knees, that's when you start to roll the ball into, or the implement into, your lap. So that's just that portion. So what do you do from there? So this is where I will also take a medicine ball and I will do squats. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find where my most comfortable lap position is. Now, this is something that can vary person to person. It depends on leverages. It depends on flexibility and mobility. You'll see some people, they will go basically to the ground with their butt, ass to grass style, and that's how they're going to get into their extension from there. Other people may be right at parallel. Other people may be slightly above parallel. I tend to have my hips a little bit higher when I'm going to load something. So where I'm going to focus on building my strength is I'm going to squat from up top, holding the implement really tight, and I'm just going to go to that depth each time. So I'm going to where my lap depth is, so I am building that strong point every single time. Another little exercise that I like to do to focus on not just the lap portion, but also the extension portion is, let's say that I have a medicine ball, and or you could even do Zerchers with this, is I will do either a medicine ball or Zercher box squat triple extension. So what the heck is this exercise? So what I'm going to do, let's say I have a medicine ball. So you've achieved the object of picking the ball off the ground, picking the object off the ground, and now you've got it into your lap. So what I like to do, I like to start from standing if I'm using a medicine ball. This is only if I'm using a medicine ball. And what I will do is I will hinge my hips back just like I would with a triple extension. I'm going to sit down on the box. I'm not going to rock back. I'm not going to rock back because what that's going to do, I'm going to be loading up my lower back way too much. This is going to be hip explosiveness. So I'm going to sit back into the box in the same exact position while holding the medicine ball. And once I touch the box, I'm going to explode up, raising as high as I possibly can while still holding the implement across my chest, squeezing the entire time with my forearms, wrists, hands, fingers, and I am going to get into triple extension with my hips. I'm going to drive straight up as quickly as possible. That's if I'm using a medicine ball. If I wanted to do this Zercher style, you can do this with an SSB. This is kind of similar to the Zercher extensions that we talked about earlier. In this case, I would prefer the SSB again because that's going to give you a little bit more of that squeeze strength that you're going to feel when you're actually holding an implement. So this is where I would actually, because I'm working on just the lap and the extension portion, I would set the pins to where I'm going to pick it up, like typically for a Zercher. So at arm height, I'm going to step out, set my feet from where I need to be for my loading position, not like my squatting position, my loading position. So your feet may be set in a different point there. So then again, I'm going to hinge my hips. I'm going to sit down on the box. And once I feel the box, that's where I explode up and extend really high with the Zercher squat or the SSB at that point. So I'm trying to work on the triple extension there, but I'm also trying to work on that explosiveness I need to get from lap to extend as high as possible. Another little exercise that I like to do, if you have a belt squat at your gym. Now, this may not apply to everybody. Not everybody has a belt squat. But if you have a belt squat at your gym, this is again working for the bottom portion of the lift. And you can also do this with the top portion of the lift. I'm going to set up a either straight bar or a closed grip attachment, depending on the implement I have. So let's say I have a Atlas stone in my competition or a sandbag. Sandbag is typically a little bit cylinder type, a little bit more round. Atlas stone is a little bit more round. So this is where I'm actually going to use that closed grip attachment that we talked about on the lat pull down. And what I am focusing on when I am picking this up, this is going to be a belt squat row. So I am getting in the exact position I would to pick the implement off the ground, and these can be loaded very heavy. I want you to try and think about what your max barbell row is and get as close to that, I would say 70 to 80% range, and do this for reps. I would say anywhere between 3 to 6 reps is enough. But what you're doing that's a little bit different is instead of just squeezing the handle super tight and getting your upper back really tight, I want you to flex your pecs inward as hard as you possibly can. What you're getting used to here is not only are you getting that first initial portion of the row done where you're trying to get it into your lap, what you're doing is you're getting used to actually squeezing that implement inward. So that implement is going to be against you the whole time. Since you don't have an implement in this case, you're going to squeeze your pecs as hard as possible as if you had something against you. So the alternative for that, if you want to work on the loading portion, is you will get a straight bar cable attachment that you might see from a cable machine that you would do like straight arm lat pull downs with or tricep push downs with. And you set your arms in a Zercher position. Now, what you're going to do, you're going to start the weight at your lat position height. So again, this could be ass to grass, this could be parallel, or this could be slightly above parallel. And all you're doing is just like the box squat triple extension, you're going to pick and extend as high as you possibly can. Again, what you're doing when you're doing the Zercher is you are pulling this in as tight to your body as you possibly can. You hinge your hips back and then explode as high as you possibly can through your heels. So what this is going to allow you to do, while it is not the actual implement itself, it's going to get you used to trying to get as high as you possibly can, because a typical target in strongman is 52 inches that you either have to load over a bar or load onto a platform. Get as high as you possibly can while also being as explosive as you possibly can, because the problem that a lot of people have is they will try to front squat these implements up. And what do I mean by that? So let's say you pick the implement off the ground, you have the implement in your lap, and the cumbersome object is in front of you. Instead of hinging their hips and actually getting their hips involved and incorporating a little bit of hip power where you kind of rear back and then push forward and up, what people will do is they'll just go straight up without actually loading their hips. So all of the pressure is now being taken on by their quads. Your quads are not going to be as strong as your hips and your quads getting involved. So what I want you to do every single time in every one of these exercises where you're working on the lat to extension is hinge those hips first and then push them forward and up. That's going to give you enough power and get you a lot higher. And you might even find that you'll be able to take, let's say it's a medicine ball, and actually put it over what your actual height is, because you're allowing your hip power to carry the implement, as opposed to just raising your arms up and putting it onto a platform.
Right, you're getting really good power transfer from lower body to upper body.
Correct. Correct.
Right, and as we talked about before with the push press, that element is essential to being able to load some of these heavier types of weights and that sort of thing, right? Like,
Correct.
I can't front raise a 300-pound stone, but
Correct.
if I can lift that with my legs, maybe, just maybe, I can get enough power drive through down low to give me some momentum to get it up high.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, and a lot of these things, to your point, there's a certain strategy involved in them. And some of it is about training the specific movement pattern, but some of it also is about training the specific demands for the exercise.
I
It's not
really I really hate using mind muscle connection, but it actually applies here more than anything else, because
definitely.
most gyms do not have Atlas stones. Most gyms do not have sandbags. Most gyms do not have kegs. And the thing is, actually feeling, since I've actually felt those implements myself, the way that I would teach them to somebody else is you have to feel a certain way in this particular muscle group. To me, like I brought it up with the carrying, but it comes back again with the loading. The squeeze strength is so paramount on all of these. So that's why even if you're working with something as light as a medicine ball or as heavy as the belt squat row, if you are not squeezing those pecs and those forearms as hard as you possibly can, that Atlas stone's never going to break the ground when you're actually ready for that on competition day.
Yeah, and ultimately, this is something we talked about before, right? Like taking everything so seriously and making each rep look similar or identical, ideally.
Hmm.
Just because it's, oh, we're using a med ball and it only weighs 12 pounds, that doesn't mean just lift it, right? Like lift it with intention and purpose. And as we
Correct.
talked about, create tension. Same thing with any of the other exercises. Going back to the deadlift for 2 seconds, right? Like if you're gonna warm up for deadlift, your deadlift at 135 and your warm up should be almost identical to how you're planning to deadlift once you get up to your working sets.
That is the biggest issue that I see with not just strongman competitors, but just average gym goers in general. So the especially with strongman, I will say it's a little bit more paramount to make everything more intentional. And some people may give me crap over this, but I put straps on with a 45-pound bar when I'm deadlifting. Now, this would be different if my deadlifting competition did not allow me to use straps. But the reason being is, again, a strap deadlift is much different than an unstrapped deadlift. So, what I'm going to do, I need to practice as many times as I possibly can getting up to my top set on setting my straps, loading my hamstrings, setting my hips. Where is my back going to be? How am I going to pull slack out of the bar? All these things that are going through my mind before I even pick up the bar, I'm doing with the 45. And if it feels off, even with the 45, I'm doing another set at the 45. Same thing with 135, 225. As I continue to add weight on the bar, my equipment is going to be the same. Now, I will say I'm not somebody that puts a belt on with a 45-pound bar. I don't think you should ultimately rely on a belt. I think you should learn how to breathe and brace without a belt first, because more often than not in our everyday lives, we're not walking around with a lifting belt on. So we have to get used to actually using our own body weight and being comfortable with using our core as well. That being said, when it comes to something like strongman, where you're allowed so many different pieces of equipment, I think it's paramount to, like, let's say, for example, let's go to the overhead press. If you're rocking wrist wraps and you need wrist wraps on your top set, I put them on from the jump because I want to feel the type of tension I need to feel from the jump. Now, don't get me wrong, between sets, do I unloosen them? Yeah. But when I'm actually going to approach the bar, I want to treat 45 pounds like I'm going to treat my 1 rep max every single time. Because if something's going to feel off, it's probably not going to be a great day. Or if I want to make it a great day, I need to take more time warming up at those lower weights.
Actually listening to those little cues and signals that your body gives you, right? Like if it
Correct.
doesn't feel right, like listen to it. There's an extreme example here, but I have someone that I rehab who tore their ACL, and in the event they were in the game they were playing in, right before they went in, they go, "I feel like someone's going to get injured," and it's like, well. Um, self-fulfilling prophecy, I guess, unfortunately.
Yes. Yes.
So it's one of those things, if things don't feel right, it's so much better to take the time and listen than end up doing something stupid and injuring yourself, because that can set you back for such a long time. And ultimately, we're trying to have a long time and a good time here, not
Correct.
just a good time. So really hammering these things and doing them with intent. I feel like we've covered a lot of the main disciplines for the strongman and how to really train them if you don't have access to a lot of the different apparatuses that might be needed. Obviously, as we've talked about before, having them is the best case scenario from a training standpoint. So much so that you've mentioned that, you and Greg and Brian, some of you guys have driven hours one way just to get access to it before comp day, which, that could be a very worthwhile trip if you're able to train with intent that day, I would say. Is there anything else that we missed or any other closing thoughts that you have, Jeff?
Just to piggyback on what you just said, ask around. Yeah,
Mm.
you might have some people that are in your gym that are training for a strongman comp that don't have implements. And they may know somebody who knows somebody, or they may know a particular gym that may be X amount of hours away or miles away. Ask around. Don't be bashful. And you may look a little silly doing some of these exercises because it's not your typical gym lift, but you also have to go in the mindset that if you want to get into strongman, you're not doing typical gym lifts. The other thing that I would add is, let's say you have all these implements, these exercises can apply to you. as well. You can implement these as accessories to build all the implement work that you do and all of the event work that you do. Don't think this is just for people that don't have access to these things. If you are fortunate enough to have these types of things at your gym, add these things to your programming and see what happens to those particular events. Because when I'm structuring my own programming, I'm structuring my program around building these particular events, and that's it. So say like I am prepping for a log press competition and then I have another competition in 4 months where it's log press again. I may not prep for an axle for a year, and that's okay because that's what the competition demands are. So, yes, you may lose a little bit of familiarity with some of the particular disciplines. I think you should ultimately always go back to the barbell basics, always incorporate some form of overhead press, bench, squat, deadlift in your programming, but just realize that none of these things are exclusive to a particular person. None of these things we've talked about today are just for the average gym goer who wants to get involved in strongman. Anybody can do this stuff. And on top of that, what you'll notice, especially with the carrying, everybody in their day-to-day lives carries something or picks something up. I can't say enough about grip strength being, a key to longevity, whether it's opening a jar or carrying the groceries in one trip. Carry something every day, even if it's just a can of food. Just carry it for a little bit, and you're going to see the benefits down the road. I can't say enough about it.
Chop wood, carry water, right?
That's right. That's right. I love that.
For sure, for sure. Jeff, for people who want to find out more about you on Instagram or the training that you do that way, where can they find you at?
So they can find me on Instagram. My handle is at Jeff underscore from underscore Insta. I told the story about it in the previous podcast. I'm not going to circle back and tell you again. And you can also find me on my website, deepbluetraining.com. That's where I have all of my in-person and online training as well. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Awesome. We will link to all of that in the description below as well. That way, if you didn't catch it, you can just check out everything Jeff's doing there. Really appreciate your time today, Jeff. Thanks for everything.
Thanks again, Dan. I appreciate it.